Well, we're in this midst of a sermon series about looking at different songs from the Bible as they're presented to us in the hope that these songs might inspire but also inform us about the different ways in which God has been at work in our world, is at work in our world, and will continue to be at work in our world. So last Sunday, I did an unofficial poll between 3 services as to what is the favorite genre of music of Central Union Church. And hands down, the winner was Christian. Now, to be fair, not all the hands went up for that, but because you are gathered here singing Christian songs and the other services sang hymns, it must be the best and favorite of the church. What I discerned after 3 services was the least favorite in our congregation is rap music. Go figure. And so today our hope is that what we can do is dive into this idea of Christian music, because within the umbrella of Christian are a bunch of different genres. So for example, how many of you like Gregorian chant? Yeah, pretty good, right? That's how the church used to worship. How many of you like traditional style, like singing hymns, for example? A few of you, yeah, that's good. How many of you like the classical things like Handel's Messiah that we're going to do on December 8th and sing together? Hallelujah. Okay, we have to practice our skill set in the Hallelujah chorus because this is the best song ever written. It goes, Hallelujah, Hallelujah. And this year, the guy that directed last year with the hair that kept beat with his head bouncing, do you remember that? He had a big afro, and he would beat, and it would keep the bounce of the beat of the whole entire movement. It's coming. So some of you like that. How many of you like contemporary music, like what we just did? I imagine you like that because that's why you're here. But how many of you have ever heard of the genre called spirituals? Spirituals? Anyone know the spirituals? The spirituals were birthed out of a community that were oppressed, and these were the songs of their community crying out to God. In essence, a lot of the spirituals are laments from the first week. They're cries about the situation they find themselves in, but spirituals have this added component of a deep faith that God's going to show up at the right time. So, for example, there's one old spiritual that I would dare say is the theme song of anyone that's ever lived under oppression. The first verse declares this: "We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday." Maybe you've heard this old spiritual before. It was birthed in the fields of slavery, as a community would gather doing the hard labor and singing a song of hope and expectation. That song then was transferred to the civil rights movement of the U.S., which became a theme song of the civil rights movement of saying that we are going to overcome that which is oppressing us, and namely racism. But it didn't stop there. It has transpired through every ocean into other countries around the world. We heard it crying in North Korea of citizens crying out for a more just society, in Beirut and Tiananmen Square, all the way down to South Africa. And everywhere in between, this theme of we shall overcome is the cry of the oppressed. That their dream and their hope is that God will move in such a way that they will overcome the reality of their lives in this moment and live into a new reality marked by freedom. And so today we gather in this hope that this song of lament might become for us a hopeful place to begin a sermon about God's justice. There's an old story about a people that were starving to death as a country. They were living in the midst of a time of famine, and they got word through the coconut wireless that another country had plenty of food. They had storehouses filled, overflowing with food. And so the leadership went to this other country to beg that they might just get enough food to feed their people. Unbeknownst to them, sitting at the decision seat is a brother of theirs who they don't recognize him, but he recognizes his brothers. And he invites not only their family, but all of their people to come during this time of famine in order to eat their fill so that no one would ever have need. Fast forward, as they live in this foreign land, the people start multiplying. Their community keeps growing with each child added, to the point that the ruler of that land begins to look out and see that the number of people of this people is growing too fast, and they might just overwhelm his people. And so he issues an edict in which the firstborn of every family, all males, must be killed. As soon as the baby is born, the midwives are supposed to kill the children to control the population. What ends up happening is that even in the midst of this edict to kill the firstborn, the population keeps growing. And it keeps growing, and so he begins to use slavery as a way to oppress the people, thinking that if I make them work hard enough, they'll be too worn out to reproduce. In the midst of it, they keep growing. As they keep growing, the oppression gets harder, the expectation higher, and the people are beginning to groan and crying out for a moment of freedom. And God hears the cry of this people, of oppression, of injustice. And he invites this young man who's out tending sheep as he walks by a bush that begins to burn but doesn't burn up, and calls out to him, "Take off your sandals, for this ground in which you tread is holy ground. You are to go to these people and to free them and to bring them to the desert where they can worship me, their God." And he immediately says, "I can't do that. I can't do that because I stutter and I don't speak well. And not only that, the people won't believe me and they'll never trust this is true because I grew up in the house of this ruler." And God smiles and laughs and presses him into calling him forward. Moses is the guy's name, and Moses goes to the house of Pharaoh, who's like a father to him, and says, "Let my people go. Let them go so that they can go worship their God." And Pharaoh says, "No." 10 plagues begin to be done, and by the 10th plague, it's so bad, the death of the firstborn son, or the firstborn, that the people in the middle of the night push the Israelites out of the community. "Get away from us. Go wherever you need to go." And the people begin their long march towards freedom. And their song of "We will overcome," I would dare say, changes to "We shall all be free. We shall all be free. We shall all be free someday." And with each step that they took away from Egypt and towards this promised land, they had this hope rising that God was at work and their freedom was at hand. They were going to be saved. Until the group at the back starts telling a tale that there's an army chasing them. And the group in the front is looking at a body of water that they can't cross. And their choice is either drown in the waters or go back to the oppression of slavery. And once more they cry out to their God. And Moses, as you know, parts the water. And what do the people do? They begin to walk through the waters on dry ground. As they're walking through the waters on dry ground, the army's approaching. And as they get to the other side, as the army comes into this channel, the waters cover over them and drowns the people, the army that's chasing them. And I imagine that the people, as they get to the other side, they rejoice that the army has been demolished, that they have freedom, and they're out of Egypt and now leading in towards the land of promise. And in the midst of that, the community begins to sing. They begin to sing an 18-verse song that's called the Song of Moses. It's a song of freedom, a song of praise, a song of how God had overcome the obstacles and set them free. In the midst of the community singing, suddenly a woman rises up by the name of Miriam. Miriam is Moses' older sister, and she's named a prophetess in this passage. And she leads the women with tambourines and with dancing. Can't you imagine? They're dancing, and where's Cheryl? You normally have a tambourine, right? And dancing and singing a celebration song because God has done something that they couldn't possibly do on their own. And so they start to sing, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he is thrown in the sea." Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he is thrown into the sea. You see, those that live under the weight of oppression, when they get to the other side of the sea and taste the promise of freedom, they can't help but to sing. It erupts out of the soul of who they are, that when they taste the reality of what they hoped for, there's nothing but rejoicing that can take place. And this passage today is a story of two songs together with this people of Israel, rejoicing for what God has done and the way that they've been set free from their oppression that they've lived under for generations on end. As we hear this story anew, it begs the question, oppression has happened in the past. Is oppression happening today? Maybe another word for oppression is injustice. Is injustice happening in our world today? Everyone that would say yes, raise your hand. Is oppression and injustice happening in the United States of America? Is oppression and injustice happening here in our islands? Yeah. And the reality is that oppression and injustice is incredibly hard to change because it's often systematic in nature. It's a systemic problem. And in my experience of talking to people that are living in injustice situations or feeling oppressed, they can name what's going on, but I've never had anyone come to me and say, you know, David, I'm really struggling with being an oppressor. I really don't know how to stop being an oppressive force promoting injustice in the world. It just doesn't happen. And the vast majority of people, if I ask you all, how many of you are oppressors, I bet no hands will go up. Because none of us see ourselves as oppressors. In fact, Pharaoh wouldn't say that he was an oppressor. He had an economic reality that helped him become incredibly wealthy. He got to build a kingdom off of the work of his slaves. He wasn't oppressing them. He was feeding them. They had full bellies. Shouldn't they be happy that they got something to eat? And the reality for our world that we live in is that injustice happens whenever there is a violation of the rights of another. It is bred whenever one group lords over, uses, abuses, or defiles another group. And in our time and in our space, we know it's happening today. And most often, to be honest, we don't like to talk about it because it makes us squirm. The language that Jesus uses is stop looking at the speck in your brother and sister's eye and start paying attention to the plank in your own eye. We don't like to see ourselves fully, if we're honest, because we're all a mix of good and a little bit of bad. And the reality is that we like to beat the drum of how good we are, and seldom do we say, I'm not hitting the mark perfectly. I need some help because I'm doing some things that aren't right. But it's really easy for us to see it in others. And so in our world today, if we look at oppression and injustice, how is that realized here among us? There's probably countless number of ways that you all could name. I want to name just three that I think are important for us as a community of faith to wrestle with. Number one, I think about the poor. The poor. Jesus said, the poor will always be among you. And somehow I've heard Christians use that as an example of why we shouldn't really pay attention and try to alleviate the concerns and needs of the poor. But the reality is that the poor have been among us, and we are called as the body of Christ to care for the least, the last, the lost, the hurting, the marginalized, the poor. And the poor is something that is systemic often. It's a cycle that happens. And often what I've found in my experience as being a minister, I get to deal with people of every economic level, is that sometimes people have this notion that if they just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, they'll be okay. That we live in America and everyone has equal opportunity, which isn't actually true. That if we're honest, our system sometimes helps ensure that the poor stay poor. And it's a challenge. And so how do we as a community, knowing that there's poverty not only in our neighborhoods out there, but there are people in our community of faith that struggle with poverty, how do we care for them that transforms their lives? Later in the service, you're going to get to hear a way that we get to partner to transform lives. And it's a simple way to ensure that kids can eat, to eat food. Profound, right? That if someone is hungry, they can't function well. In our community, we know of many children that are going 24 hours without food because their families can't afford it. And so how do we work together to address poverty and the root forms of what creates poverty cycles in our society? Secondly, if we're going to talk about injustice and oppression, for me, I think we have to talk about what our community of faith, not Central Union, but Christianity in general, and what society at large has done to the LGBT community. I think in many ways that I heard it for years and years that the concern about the rights for homosexual individuals to marry would destroy the institution of marriage. And I remember a friend of mine that is gay said, I think you heterosexuals did a great job all on your own. If your divorce rate's 50%, I think that's your own problem. And as we began to talk about it, what we started talking about is that if we really believe that God is love, and that all love is birthed from God's heart, that if love is realized in our world, and two consenting adults fall in love with each other, how is that not a gift of God? If God is the God of love, love is love. Unconditional. And so we as a congregation in 2014 stepped out in a major way of faith right before I came here, in which this congregation had to make a decision about how they would welcome the LGBT community. We in the sanctuary gather beneath a banner that says what? Love never faileth. And this congregation voted to allow same-gender weddings here on our campus. I've gotten to perform many of these weddings. I think Brandon's done a few of these weddings as well. And what I've decided from my own experience of marrying heterosexual couples and homosexual couples is that everybody has puppy love, and it's adorable on a wedding day. That we are a community of faith called to engage and embrace all as we seek to embody Christ. And the only people that Jesus ever dared to threaten to exclude from the community was the religious community. Do you get that? The religious community is who Jesus has the harshest words for because they are excluding those outside of themselves. Maybe we need to go back and remember the way of Christ. The third, which may be one of these ones that is known, maybe it's unknown to you, but one of the strongest issues I think we have is the issue of racism. Has anybody ever heard of racism? Has racism happened in Hawaii? Yeah? So I moved here 5.5 years ago. I came from Kansas. Kansas is a very white state. And our town that we were in was like 94% Caucasian, Howleys. And I remember talking to people that said, racism isn't really an issue. I don't know anyone that struggles with it. I think that's the group's trying to make it into something that's not. And as I engaged people with that, I'd ask them, how many of your friends aren't white? And often they would say, well, none. Why? You see, what I realized was that me as a white man, and 94% of the community is white, we didn't feel racism because we kind of ruled the community in a weird way. We had the privilege and the posture to not feel racism because we were the dominant group. Then I moved to Hawaii, and I was amazed at this church and this congregation and the community that's full of every color under the sun. It's beautiful, right? And I thought, oh, this is great. There's going to be no racism in Hawaii. And then I went surfing. And if you've ever been surfing, you realize that there is some racism here. And depending on where you go in this community depends on the racism. And racism is often used as a way to scapegoat other groups. All these people are alike. All these people of this skin color are going to be like this or do this. And what we do is we often talk about racism under the surface. And it's not always overt or direct, but it's the way that we view each other. Can I look at people as a white man that aren't white and see them as my equal, my brother, my sister? Can I see beyond the externals of our lives and look to the heart of who we are? And the challenge of racism, it's really hard to change. Just 2 weeks ago, my wife and I went to go see Harriet, a new movie that came out about Harriet Tubman, one of the leaders of the Underground Railroad. If you don't go see any movie, go see Harriet. It is profound, it is disturbing, and it is historic. And what you realize is the racism that was there in the midst of that reality, of that culture, hasn't changed all that much, though it's better, but we are yet to be at a place where we declare that all people are created equal and we live it. And this movie highlights the reality of the economic reason why the South didn't want to get rid of slavery, because it was impacting the finances of the white folk. And the reality for us in Hawaii is, how do we deal with racism? Do we have racism in our church? Please, God, say no. But it could be. Because racism is a place of soul, of how we view others. And so I say these three things as an attempt and an invitation to start paying attention to ourselves. How are we seeing our neighbor? How are we seeing those that aren't like us and those that are? How are we treating the marginalized and the struggling? How do we bless them? You see, I have to be really honest with you. I've struggled with this sermon more than any sermon all year, because I've never experienced oppression. I'm a white man in America. I have to be honest with you. I grew up in privilege. I never went hungry. We always had more than enough food. I always had clothes on my body. I grew up in a decent middle-class home in Baltimore, Maryland. And I don't understand the world of oppression and injustice from living underneath of it. I've been incredibly fortunate in my life to live in a place of privilege, to be able to afford to live in such a place that my kids don't have to ask, when is our next meal coming? And yet I serve in a community in which I hear these stories of real life people, some gathered on this campus today. They're trying to strive to create a better life for their kids, of breaking out of the cycles that they find themselves raised in, of trying to live into who God made them to be. And for me, the reason why I struggled with this sermon is I can't speak from an experience of feeling freedom from oppression. And so for me, as a white man in America, I had to pay attention to what role have I perpetuated, if any, in our society. All of you are somewhere in the spectrum of oppression, oppressed, oppressor. And our call is to be a people that follow the way of Jesus Christ and advocate for the good of all people. To advocate that any injustice is injustice to everyone. And that we should be beating the drumbeat of the song of the hope that anyone that lives with injustice or oppression sings. We are free. We are free. Thank God today that I am free. As we continue in worship, there's an old spiritual that I've been playing off of called We Shall Overcome. Do you know that song? We shall overcome. At every service, we've invited the congregation to sing it, because it's a statement of solidarity with those that are living with injustice and oppression, that we are with you in this fight, and that we're going to do all that we can as a community of faith to side with you and to advocate and to be part of the solution. So I invite you to sing with us, We Shall Overcome, as we sing it in faith and in hope.